Hey guys and girls, here today to introduce our next unit, probably our final full unit of the school year. So we're not going to get as far as I would have liked. I wanted to at least get into the 80s. We're probably going to wrap up in the 1960s, might cover a little bit of the 70s. So it is what it is. No one could have predicted global pandemic. But at least we're going to get through the civil rights and the Kennedy and Johnson eras. It's one of my favorite time periods in 20th century American history. Alright. So topic 9, Civil Rights and Reform in the 1960s. And this actually takes us up to 1975. Alright, so a couple of central questions. How can we ensure equality for all? What were the causes, the main events, and the effects of the civil rights movement? It's going to be the first real big question we're going to look at. We'll cover sections 1 through 3. We'll have a quiz. And then sections 4 and 5 will deal on how did the policies of President Kennedy and Johnson affect the nation. All right, so we're going to cover section 1 notes today. The civil rights movement strengthens. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the history of the civil rights movement, review stuff that happened in the 40s and 50s. So we don't, because it's technically early civil rights, though as we covered it over the last couple of units, we didn't really call it the civil rights movement. Generally, when we talk civil rights movement, we're talking the 1960s. We'll explain the importance of the landmark cases, Brown versus Board of Education, the controversy that called over school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then wrap up today with the Montgomery bus boycott and its impact. All right, segregation limits equality. We talked about Jim Crow laws, or de jure segregation. That's segregation that is imposed by law. When we talked all the way back in first quarter about Reconstruction with the Supreme Court decision in 1896 known as Plessy v. Ferguson that ruled segregation was constitutional as long as the facilities for blacks and whites were separate but equal. The key word there was they could be separated, but they had to be equal. As we know, that was never the case. Here's a famous political cartoon about Plessy v. Ferguson. You see the white water fountains, this nice marble angel, and then you see water fountain for African Americans is this old, rusted one in a field. So even though the Supreme Court said it had to be separate but equal, the government never enforced that. States, especially in the South, never enforced this law. So the facilities were absolutely never equal. So in the South, but also parts of the North, this led to segregation extended to most areas of public life, schools, hospitals, transportation, restaurants, etc. In the North, where African Americans didn't face quite the segregation they faced in the South, they did also face what was called de facto segregation. This was segregation that was by unwritten custom or tradition. So unlike de jure segregation, it was not imposed by law. Big examples of de facto segregation was employment. Again, everything being equal, they give the job to a white person over an African American. Same with housing, apartments to rent, etc., which led African Americans to having to live in subpar housing, subpar apartment buildings, which contributed to the birth of these urban ghettos. So they absolutely faced segregation in the North as well. Because of this, African Americans often occupied the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. No sharecropping in the South. Why they left the South to come North. So they lived in higher poverty, higher illiteracy rates, as well as lower rates of home ownership and life expectancy. And unfortunately, even though all the positive gains that have been made over the years for minority groups, a lot of that tends to hold true today if we compared the economic data for African Americans compared to white Americans. They generally fall lower on the ladder, unfortunately. So there's still a lot of progress to be made. One of the benefits, though, for African Americans living in the North was they could exercise their vote, whereas in the South, which was ran by for a while, Southern Democrats until FDR, and then African Americans join the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party evolves, and the Southern Democrats become Republicans. But in the South, African Americans were prevented from voting with things like poll taxes, so they had to pay a tax to vote, or literacy tests, where they had a higher rate of literacy in the South. So that prevented African Americans from exercising the right to vote. All right, I said I was going to cover a little early history of civil rights movements, and really it begins in World War II. It sets the stage for the modern civil rights movement. FDR, for example, he banned discrimination in defense industries. Remember, we talked about A. Philip Randolph. He organized his March on Washington. FDR signed the executive order, desegregating defense industries. He didn't go as far as Randolph wanted. He didn't desegregate the military. That will happen under Truman. As vice president and future president, Truman desegregates the military. You also have CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality. That adopted the nonviolent protest movement, which was based off Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and Mahatma Gandhi in India. They took their ideas for the nonviolent protest movement, and obviously the disciple of that will be, who we'll talk about a lot later on, next section, in the section after, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be a big disciple of the nonviolent protest movement. As I said, Truman desegregated the military. He also set up the Committee on Civil Rights, the first real president to look into civil rights legislation. And of course, we'll see a couple civil rights legislations or acts passed with Truman. Truman's doesn't get passed, but then we'll see Kennedy and Johnson. So as we move forward here, the Democratic Party becomes a role reversal. Before they were the party of segregation, they eventually become the party of civil rights and champion the rights of African Americans. Of course, you also have athlete Jackie Robinson, becomes the first African American to play in Major League Baseball. They used to have what was called the Negro League, where African Americans were forced to play. Well, he breaks the racial barrier in baseball and helps pave the way for other racial barriers to be broken. All right, so move on to Brown v. Board of Education. A little background, and then we'll get to the landmark Supreme Court decision. So the NAACP, you guys should all remember, National Advancement Association for Colored People, began to challenge Plessy v. Ferguson, or these separate but equal laws, by bypassing the states and going right to federal court. Two of the brilliant lawyers that championed the NAACP legal effort was Charles Hamilton Houston. He was the dean of Howard University Law School, and Thurgood Marshall, very important figure. Thurgood Marshall also became the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court. And there's Houston and Marshall. So their strategy was to chip away at segregation. A couple important cases that helped do that, and you don't need to know these specifically, was Sweatt v. Painter. Supreme Court ruled that Texas violated the 14th Amendment by establishing a separate but unequal all-black law school. The 14th Amendment was citizenship. The Citizenship Amendment passed during Reconstruction. So basically gave African Americans U.S. citizenship after the 13th Amendment freed them from slavery. And then McLaurin versus Oklahoma State. The Supreme Court ruled that Oklahoma violated George McLaurin's rights by being denied access to the university's dining hall, library, and classrooms. So these two cases set the stage for Brown v. Board of Education. So they were at the higher level universities. NAACP wanted to desegregate all public schools from K through 12. So they did so with Brown v. Board. The Brown family of Topeka, Kansas, pictured there at the bottom right, the mother and her daughter, wanted to challenge the court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision. Basically, the daughter was forced to ride a bus an hour long to a much farther away school when there was a school very close to her, but it was for only white students. So the NAACP took the case, challenged it in the Supreme Court. All nine justices of the Supreme Court agreed with the NAACP that segregated education violated the Constitution. And there on the bottom left is Chief Justice Earl Warren. He led the Supreme Court, and he wrote, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." So he ruled that Plessy v. Ferguson was not allowed in the sphere of education. Eventually, Plessy v. Ferguson will be completely dismantled and obviously is no longer the law. There's a great video on Brown v. Board. I posted the link. You can either pause the notes now and go watch it, or you can watch it afterwards. All right, moving on to Little Rock, Arkansas. So many Southern political leaders vowed not to integrate their schools following the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board. So Little Rock, Arkansas became the scene for this challenge. The school board approved a plan for gradual integration that becomes opposed by the governor, Orville Thalbus, who sent in the National Guard to prevent the 9 black students who volunteered to enroll in the white school. In return, President Eisenhower, who was now president after Truman, sent in federal troops to protect the 9 students and enforce the Supreme Court's decision. While Eisenhower himself wasn't an extreme champion of civil rights, he obviously as president and former commander in World War II, respected the law, and the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board, this is the law, so he sent in troops to enforce it. You can see some pictures from the Little Rock 9. There's videos on it that you can watch. You obviously hear some very terrible language, a lot of racial epithets thrown at the African-American students exercising their right. Later that year, Congress passed the first several civil rights acts. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, which established the Civil Rights Commission and gave it the power to investigate violations of civil rights. It also gave the Attorney General of the United States the power to protect voting rights of African Americans. There's another short video on Little Rock 9, posted on the class page again. You can pause the notes now and watch it, or watch it at the end. All right, to wrap up today, the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, on the bus ride home from work, Rosa Parks took a seat in the Negro section in the back of the bus. Later on, the driver asked her to give up her seat as a white passenger. When she refused, the cops were called and she was arrested. And there's a picture of Rosa Parks. Some people wonder if this was spontaneous or whether Rosa Parks planned this in advance and the NAACP planned this in advance to challenge segregation and transportation. Rosa Parks always said this was a spontaneous thing. She never planned this. But the NAACP convinced her that this incident was the case they needed and were waiting for to challenge Plessy v. Ferguson in the sphere of transportation. And they hired a young African-American lawyer, Fred Gray, as her attorney. African-American leaders also organized a bus boycott. One leader in particular, Martin Luther King Jr., gave an inspirational speech. Tired of segregation and oppression, he urged that nonviolent protest. I said, again, he was a disciple of the nonviolent protest movement. This is really where he makes a name for himself with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1957. The year-long boycott worked, and it won a major victory for the black community. It received favorable national media attention, and King found himself a national celebrity and the leader of the civil rights movement. It also won a huge Supreme Court decision in 1956. The Supreme Court concurred with the earlier appeals court that ruled in favor of Rosa Parks. There would be no segregation on public transportation. In January 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. and some other 60 black ministers created the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, based in Atlanta. This would be the group that really led the charge for civil rights in the South. And it would continue that struggle throughout the next decade in the 1960s by, again, advocating nonviolent resistance to fight injustice. And there's our last short video. Go with section 1 on the Montgomery bus boycott. So that's a wrap on section 1. We'll pick up with section 2 next week. And I hope you guys have a great weekend.